Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Fradkin, and this is the Roundtable Chats podcast, a platform where ideas are challenged and the life stories of extraordinary people from around the globe are explored, one conversation at a time. Today, my guest is Nate Andorsky. Nate is an entrepreneur blending behavioral economics, data, and technology to help changemakers inspire and move people to action. He's the co-founder and CEO of Creative Science, a company that leverages behavioral economic theories to understand the emotional, social, and cognitive factors that drive us to action, and then use this to create compelling websites and digital strategies. Nate hired me as a behavioral econ specialist after I graduated from GW, and it was a dream job. For anyone listening that has entrepreneurial desires or needs advice going into the daunting job market, this is the episode for you. And now, without further ado, here is Nate Andorsky. Nate, welcome to the round table.
Thank you so much for having me, Thomas. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. A question I always like to start with is, what are you grateful for?
I am grateful for, I would say two things. Number one is just the opportunities that I've been gifted in life, and some of my being able to find something that I'm passionate about and I enjoy doing day in and day out.
And what are you passionate about? What gets you up in the morning? You know, what gets you working hard?
Yeah, so I've got a passion for creation, right? So for just building things, right? And that's something that's been very evident since I was a young kid, and that's something that I think really drives me and gets me out of bed in the morning and keeps me working.
And yeah, and so what kind of opportunities have you had? You know, I think you've had quite a unique life. I heard about you through Creative Science, the current company that you founded. But what other opportunities kind of came into your life a bit? You know, what was your path?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I mean, so a little bit about my background is I currently run a company called Creative Science, but I've had the entrepreneurial tick since I was a young kid. And a lot of that was very evident from my early days. And the first place that I saw it actually really pop up was in high school. I actually was, my dad and I had this deal where we had to save money for college. And what he would do is he basically matched the dollar that we saved for college, $1 for $1. And at the time I was kind of aggravated because I didn't want to have to like put away money. But now looking back, that's like a pretty phenomenal return you can get on putting away money. But I was working as a busboy in high school, and I was making, next to nothing, maybe $30 or so a shift, and I was working long hours, and I was just kind of looking for a better way to make money, something more exciting. And I was in a math class with one of my friends in high school. I must have been, I think it was my sophomore year, and he had told me how he had sold some items on eBay and made some quick cash. I was like, oh, that's actually interesting. So I went around my house and I found some old DVDs that I had. I put them up on eBay and I sold them really quickly. And within just a couple of hours, I made, 60 or $70, which, I mean, now is not a ton of money, but when you're in high school, I mean, that's decent cash. And then I ran out of an inventory. So I was looking for ways to continue this. So what I started doing is I launched a company in high school called Easy Selling. And basically what I would do was I would go around and collect items from other people, and I would sell them on eBay. It started out just selling people's literal junk, so things they had around their house that they just didn't want anymore, but they just hadn't had the time to get rid of. And then eventually it grew to the side where I actually sold a few cars on eBay, like actual cars. And what's really fascinating about it is actually by the time I went to college, my dad actually had to stop me from putting money away because he didn't want to match it anymore.
That's how you know you succeeded. Yeah. Wow. That's really amazing. No, that you did that eBay thing. I actually can relate to that in a weird way. When I started college, my economics professor told us about this huge opportunity where you could buy the new iPhone. I think it was iPhone 5S at the time for $200, and you could sell it for like $1,000 or $1,200 on eBay. You know, and a lot of people were like impressed by that, but didn't act on it. But like as soon as I heard that, I'm like, I need to buy iPhones, you know. And I got to do it for a little bit. It was a brief time window, but I always thought that was really cool, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that so when I was in college, one of the things I used to do to make some cash was I would buy cell phones on Craigslist and sell them on eBay,
Hmm.
which is the same type of thing. And it was just weird. I was home for break one year and I was perusing Craigslist and I saw that the prices on Craigslist, the phones were going for about, $60 to $80 less than they would go for on eBay. So I was like, this seems too good to be true. And I started buying some cell phones on Craigslist, selling them on eBay. And sure enough, it wasn't too good to be true. And I just kind of kept doing that to make some easy side cash.
Sure. Yeah. Why not? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So you had that going on, and going into college as well. What were kind of the next opportunities that came into your life that were entrepreneurial or creative? You know.
Yeah, so I, went off to college and I couldn't do the eBay business anymore, or in the capacity that I was doing it,
Hmm.
just because I needed a car to go pick up people's stuff. So that slowly morphed into this buying and selling of cell phones. So that was part of my entrepreneurial endeavor in college, and then also I was in the business school at GW, and I didn't want to do any of the majors they had,
Hmm.
so they actually had this interesting program where you could build your own course curriculum and then petition the school basically to approve it. So I built my own course curriculum in entrepreneurship, and then
Hmm.
petitioned the school to let me do it, and they did. So
Wow.
I don't know for sure, but I was probably one of the first people to have a quote unquote entrepreneurship concentration at GW.
Nice.
So it was really exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible because I was very dissatisfied with my business school experience at George Washington University, and went to the same school, but many years later, and like I was doing a BS in finance and economics at the time. They had just
Yeah.
created the BS in finance degree when I arrived in 2013, and I learned a lot, and it's a great degree if you want to go to Wall Street, which I didn't want to do, but like I would have loved to have created my own program, and of course, it would have been even more robust when I was there than versus when you were there. But that's really cool. Like what kind of courses did you take or design? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, so they had the core courses I had to take still. So there was your basic finance,
Hmm.
statistics, and I think there was, some accounting courses. So you couldn't get around those, which, but on top of that, I can kind of pick and choose. So part of what I did was actually I did a few internships that I was able to receive credit for, which was really great. And then they had a couple entrepreneurship courses within the business school that I kind of put in there. One was, how to start a small business. There was also another course that I took was a leadership course that was great. That was actually really, I
Hmm.
think it was probably one of the best courses I took in college.
Wow.
Um, but it was kind of all over the place. The school back then wasn't as strong in terms of entrepreneurship curriculum as they are now,
Sure.
but I
Yeah.
was still able to piece something together, which was nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to hear a little more about that leadership course, because again, that was something that I didn't know existed, and maybe you're the first to be in a course like that. But who was your professor? How many students were in it? I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, it was a small course, and my professor was, I can't remember his name. It was, um, I think it was Terabishi might have been his last name.
Hmm.
I'm trying to remember, but it was all about how to get people. It wasn't like leadership 101 where you walk in and this is how you lead. He taught the course very much through showing. And the way that he did that was, for example, he came in one day and he had a goal in mind, something that he wanted the entire class to agree to. But he didn't come in and sort of tell us this is what the goal is and this is how we're going to get there. He started asking students different questions, and kind of gradually leading us to the conclusion that he had already created in his mind.
Hmm.
And what was really fascinating about that, it was the first time that I was exposed to this idea where it's a lot more powerful if you can get people to come to a conclusion through their own way of thinking rather than telling them to do something.
Hmm.
So at the conclusion, he basically showed us, this is actually where I wanted everyone to go. I could have walked in here and said, listen, this is the goal. This is how we're going to get there. But instead, the way I went about doing it and framing it was, I don't want to say trick like it was manipulative, but he he geared us in such a way that we came to this conclusion by ourselves. Well, actually, as a class together, and it was much more powerful because then you have the whole entire class bought into this idea because it was ours, right? It wasn't his.
Huh. Yeah, that's incredibly inspirational. Wow. I mean, I wish there were more professors like that. I think I had some as well. I mean, my courses were always quite rigid because they're quantitative. I had a guy named Dr. Khalid Sharif, who's from Egypt. He has a PhD. Worked at the World Bank for like 25 years, like really brilliant mind, but he also kind of took a very different approach where he wouldn't just tell us what to think. The class was on investing, but he wouldn't say like, this is how you invest, this is the tried and true method or whatever. He didn't even have us read a textbook. He just would, have these really interesting conversations with us. And then kind of sounds like similar to that, let us come to our own conclusions, and he really wanted our active participation. So that was super useful.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point is that you've got to be able to like learn by doing it. It's so tried and true. I mean, there's so many lessons that I've learned through my entrepreneurial journey that like they exist in a textbook, right? Somebody's written a case study about them, but there's just some things you can't really, I think, learn and appreciate until you've actually done it yourself.
Yes.
And that way of learning is just so much more powerful because it really sticks with you and you really ingrain that sort of idea and concept.
Yeah, and so continuing, I'm just very curious, during your time at GW and doing this entrepreneurship, tailored program, did you meet other future entrepreneurs or current entrepreneurs while you're studying at GW? Did you form any connections or relationships there that proved fruitful? What was the culture like?
Yeah, not really.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of the individuals that I know from college went on to get a job somewhere or a profession. So as far as GW goes, there wasn't. I don't think there's actually a ton of people from GW that have sort of taken the same path.
Right. Okay. No, that's totally fair. That's the truth. And while you're doing those programs, did that solidify in your mind more? Like, yeah, this is what I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to create my own companies or projects, and do my own thing. Like, did it help solidify that, or were you just always very interested in doing that sort of thing, and it just helped facilitate that?
I think I was always interested. I kind of knew from my days in high school that this is what I wanted to do. And during college, I think actually what helped more was it wasn't the in-classroom learnings I had. It was actually the outside classroom learning. So even though GW's business school, I didn't thoroughly enjoy, I think what they actually do a phenomenal job of doing as a school in general is that it's built into the culture there that you have multiple internships as part of your education. And that actually, I learned a lot from those internships that I had throughout college, and those were really beneficial. And I think teaching me some skills in regards to business, but in addition to that too, is just kind of figuring out exactly what I wanted to do.
And okay, so of the internships you did, is there one that stands out in particular? Where like, wow, I really learned a lot about this industry or this, way of life and learned skills and, real world experience?
Yeah, so I actually had an internship with a company called On Sale Promos, and what they did was they basically did promotional. So if you're Verizon Wireless and you need 200,000 hats with your logo on it, that's the type of things that they do. But what was interesting is they actually were launching these sort of like mini brands that were meant to concentrate the college market. So they had a brand underneath On Sale Promos that was called, I think it was Colonial Promos actually. And it was the same back end office, right? But the branding and marketing was just for GW. And the whole idea was it was supposed to be run by college students. So the college liked it because it gave students a chance to try something entrepreneurial at a real business. And then for On Sale Promos, it was great because it gave them access to deal flow. So my responsibility for about a year or so was to basically head up that program at GW. So that was actually really exciting.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. No, that's really good. And how long were you interning there?
So I interned there for a summer, and then I think through a semester or two, I did. So maybe close to maybe about a year.
And maybe for some of our listeners, I know, like, yeah, GW did a really good job of both instilling the importance of doing internships and I think providing a lot of opportunities. But for someone who's in college now and is trying to look for their first internship, is there any advice you could give them, a way to network or, find something?
Yeah, I would say, well, first and foremost, just because a company doesn't have something posted on their website about an internship doesn't mean they're not offering it. I mean,
Mm,
for a lot of companies, they would gladly take a smart person, even if they're still in college, even if they're not advertising for it. The other thing I would say too is like pick up a side project, right? I mean,
mm,
a lot of what I did in college was I had side projects or side businesses I was running, and not only did I learn a ton from those, but when I went to actually apply for a job, everybody took an accounting course, everybody took a finance
yes.
course, everyone had a major in something. The thing that set me apart though was, oh, you did this thing that nobody told you to do. You
Mm,
did it because you wanted to do it, and what did you learn from it?
right.
So those types of things can actually start to really build your own credibility and brand, and it's also a great learning experience.
Yeah, no, okay, no, that's really, really good advice, for sure. And playing off the first piece a little bit, something I discovered kind of late at GW, but proved to be very, very effective, is just volunteering in places. So if
Yeah.
there's somewhere I really want to work, like I even
Yeah.
applied this recently this year, I contacted, this leading neuroeconomist, and I just messaged him and I said, look, I just want to volunteer at your lab this
Right.
summer, and we called and talked on the phone, and kind of as a test, he said, like, we won't be able to pay you, and immediately I said, oh, no, no, I don't want to be paid. Like, I just want to get the experience, right? And learn. So, if you just volunteer and just, I like the motto, like, how can I help you? If you just have that question running in your head, and anyone you network with, any employer, anybody you talk to, and you're just thinking, how can I make their life easier, will take you so far. Like, they'll love that typically. So,
Exactly. And just to your point, what you did, I mean, I don't, that professor probably didn't have an internship program
no,
public
no.
but you'd be surprised because you've actually done it too when you work with us a little bit
Yes,
is reaching out to somebody, sending them a message, and like they usually will respond and you can have a conversation with them.
exactly.
So don't be intimidated just because you're young and you don't think you have a ton of experience. Like if you see somebody doing something that you want to do, like shoot them a message. The worst thing that can happen is they don't respond, and
Exactly.
you don't have anything to lose.
Yeah, the nothing to lose mentality is very powerful, and yeah, just speaking a bit to when I think I messaged you on LinkedIn. I think it started where you had made some post that explained framing, gave some
Mm-hmm.
example, and then I commented just adding to it or whatever. Like when I did that, I was not looking for a job. I wasn't
Yeah.
even looking to even contact you necessarily or get to hear your story more. I was just curious, and I was happy to hear something about behavior economics on LinkedIn. And then I think we had talked for a bit, and initially, like, I didn't want to stay in DC because it's very expensive. I wanted to go back to Boulder. So I think at first, I wasn't gonna work for you. And then it wasn't until a few months later, though, that I like woke up at like 1 a. I like got up at 1 a.m. and thought, I'm like, oh shit, no, like this is an amazing opportunity. I think you had then made a job posting for like Behavioral Econ Specialist and described
Right.
what that would entail. And I'm like, holy shit. If I don't seize that opportunity, it's never gonna, like, that's such a rare thing to be studying economics undergrad, but being really into behavior economics, and to find a job right after graduation in something I'm like passionate about. Like, come on, like I have to
Right.
seize that. So then I emailed you, if you still needed an opening or whatever, and we worked it out. And I ended up working remotely in Boulder. But that was a great like first job out of college because
Mm-hmm.
again, like perfect fit for me. I really enjoyed doing the research. It was quite fruitful and just the whole setup of it, And so
Yeah.
I was very thankful for that. And I'm curious, yeah. So continuing your journey, right? You had these really valuable internships that you learned so much from. You had your side projects. You graduate from the George Washington University. What was your next move? What did you do next?
I got. I worked for Northwestern Mutual for a little bit, selling life insurance,
Mm,
and I was actually there for not too long, maybe 3 or 4 months. And then I got actually poached by another company called Liquidity Services, and they basically did reverse logistics. So they were an eBay for the government, right? So if the government had, I don't know, 1,000 SUVs that they didn't use anymore and they wanted to sell it, they basically had a marketplace where they could sell that for them. So I was actually there for a little bit, and then there were some layoffs about 3 months into my role there. So I left there and then got a job at a company called Interactive.
Hmm. And what was that like?
That was good. It while I was actually at Interactive, they were just a web design development agency, and I learned a fair amount. It was a small company though, but while I was there, I actually launched a company called DC3, and it was a dorm room cleaning college company. So I knew that I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. I didn't have the means to basically quit my job and live full time off of something. So what I did was, and I always tell people this when they're looking to get into something that's entrepreneurial, but they still have a full-time job, is like, you can still do something on the side, right? There's no reason that you can't. And that's what I did is I launched a dorm room cleaning company while I still had a full-time job.
Yeah, and so how did you get that idea for the dorm room clean opportunity? Like, did you just see there was an opportunity out there that people wanted something more convenient to clean their dorms, or like, yeah, how did you get the idea?
Yeah, so I got the idea because, when I was in college, oftentimes I would hear people say something to the extent of, I wish there was a cleaning company to come clean my dorm room, right? So I knew there was an opportunity there, and then also there was no company currently, at least within the DC metropolitan area, that was specifically targeted at cleaning colleges. So that's kind of where the idea came from.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I mean that's what entrepreneurship is all about. You hear some sort of problem that's bothering people, and then come up with a simple solution.
Right.
And how long did you do that kind of, the cleaning company thing?
Yeah, so it ran for probably about 2 or 3 years, and then I eventually shut it down on the surface. And this was actually one of my bigger learning lessons is on the surface, it seems like a really great idea, but fundamentally from a business model perspective, it's very hard to execute. It doesn't scale.
Yeah.
There's, if you had to write a case study on like some of the worst businesses to start, company is probably up there. It was, so basically what we did was, because we didn't have a ton of cash to begin, we didn't hire a full-time crew. So we were playing middleman. We branded as DC3, and then as we would get requests for jobs, we would contract those out to local cleaning companies. But one of the main issues was, well, number one, there just wasn't a ton of money to go around, right? So I get a lead, then I pass it off to a cleaning company, and when everything's said and done, not making a ton of money off of each clean.
Right.
Also, if you actually do the math, students are only in college for about 6 months of the year, right? So I had a business that was running for 6 months of the year, which was not phenomenal either.
Right.
And also scheduling was a nightmare, right? So I had to line up all of these different cleans with everyone's schedule. And then guess what happens after winter break?
Yeah, what?
Everyone's schedule completely changes. So I had to go back and just as I was able to sort of iron everything out perfectly, I had to go back and then reschedule everything again. So it was tough. And then the long-term play was I was trying to get these contracts with these universities. I was in talks with GW, Georgetown, and American to become like the official cleaning company of the university. And just as anyone who's ever dealt with universities before, they're very bureaucratic. So I was in quote unquote contract talks, negotiations, for years. And then I eventually kind of just saw the writing on the wall, like this is just not going to happen. So.
Yeah. And, during that whole process, right, you're doing it for a few years. Was there anybody in your peer network or friends who were saying, "Hey, Nate, like this sounds like it's really stressing you out. Maybe you shouldn't be doing this," or like anybody kind of concerned or thinking of the drawbacks?
Not that I can specifically remember. I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I'm just curious because I've always felt like I'm entrepreneurial. I've never really pursued it that fully. I've done kind of side projects, as you call them, but like this podcast. But I'm always really fascinated by entrepreneurs, and it's just like there's so much unpredictability to it, and I was curious, yeah, just looking more into your character now, like what traits do you think makes for a good entrepreneur? Like what qualities should someone have that would help them with that?
Well, there's perseverance. I'll
Yeah.
tell you that. Um, there's this idea of just never giving up, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially ones that seem like their overnight successes, aren't. If you
Mm,
actually start to dig into their history and what they've done, you'll find quickly that what seemed like an overnight success had been 10, 15, 20 years in the making, whether that's that current business or other things that they were doing. So I think the media does a really phenomenal job at portraying this idea that you wake up in the middle of the night, this brilliant idea,
right.
you go build an app, and the next thing you know, you're on the front page of Fortune magazine, and that's just not the way it happens.
Mm,
Maybe once in a blue moon that does happen, but for the most part, um, your idea is just going to get run into the ground. And there's a Mike Tyson quote that says that everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face.
yes.
And that's
Yeah. I love that quote. Yeah.
indicative of launching a company. There's also a really interesting article that was written a while ago by Sarah Vathi. She's a professor at Darden
Mm,
about the way that entrepreneurs go about creating companies versus people who work in large corporations. And she called it effectual entrepreneurship. And
mm,
she basically said that they are masters at figuring out what they can do with the resources that they are provided. So
mm,
the best way to think of this is, let's say, Thomas, that you walk into a kitchen and I give you 20 ingredients and I
mm.
say, make something. Entrepreneurs are very good at figuring out what they can make from those ingredients rather than working backwards with, I have a recipe.
Yeah.
Now I
Right.
find out what I need to build that recipe.
Huh.
Um, and that way of thinking is very different than sort of corporate America and how you go about building, right? So corporate America is very like, I have an idea, let's build, let's get together this plan, build a huge strategy, then execute to it. Where entrepreneurship, especially in the early days, is very much it's the opposite. It's starting to figure out, what can I build from the resources that I have, and then tweak that to figure out where there's a product market fit.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I just thought this fits perfectly with what you were saying. The analogy. Have you heard the analogy like the cook versus the chef?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So it's totally that, and right, yeah, you could just say somebody who works in a company is like a cook. You give them instructions, they do it, they're very efficient. But a chef can just create something, from scratch, or can just, yeah, you just give some ingredients and then they just create something, and it's a much higher level, I think. I think people should strive in a sense to be more like a chef than a cook.
Right.
And I've always been attracted to chefs in a way. Like I am not a good chef at all. Like I'm not speaking personally, but my mother, she's French, and she's an incredible chef. Because I don't say cook, because whenever we have guests over, and her woman friends, they ask like, "Oh, what's your recipe?" Like she doesn't have an answer to give them. She's like, I don't know. Like I don't measure, I don't quantify, I just do. You know. And so I've always been attracted to that. So I think that is great advice for someone who's thinking of being an entrepreneur, is to think more like a chef than a cook. Yeah.
Yep. And then the other piece of advice I would give too, and this is something that I've started to realize, and I stole this from Steve Jobs. He did a commencement speech once, and one of the lines in his commencement speeches was that you can only connect the dots looking backwards. And it's so true, right? I had this
Mm,
eBay business in high school. I sold cell phones in college. I ran a dorm room cleaning company, and now I run a technology company. And you look at those trends and you go, they don't really have a lot in common. But once you really look into what I do, and I look back at my trajectory of what I've done, there are so many things I learned from those businesses that have gotten me to where I am today. And
yeah.
you can't forecast too far in advance. So you've got to just kind of pursue what it is that you're interested in, and then just have confidence, and eventually it'll get you to the place that you want to be.
Mm, yeah. No, that makes complete sense. And another quality that I think is important for an entrepreneur, and I want to hear your perspective on, is like resiliency to like failure. Like, what do you do when you encounter failure? Because I mean, you would know this better than most. You've probably seen failures all the time. Like, how do you kind of bounce back or learn from failure?
Yeah, I think you got to just really view it. And I say view it, but I think actually internalize it, that it's part of the process,
Hmm.
right? It's a learning experience. It's getting you closer to what you want to be doing. The dorm room cleaning company, for example, I mean, that failed. right?
Yeah.
It never really got off the ground, but I learned so much from that experience that I could have never learned in a classroom, that I learned firsthand through doing. And those lessons and those ideas I've been able to take with me as I've pursued other entrepreneurial ventures.
Yeah, absolutely. And it must have really built your character too, because it's like, hey, I mean, I survived this, this catastrophe. So what is there to fear, moving forward? I can handle it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it builds up that resilience muscle, right? When you do encounter something difficult and you fail and then you bounce back, it starts to train your mind that you can overcome obstacles. And the more that you actually fail, the more that you overcome it, the stronger that muscle gets within yourself, saying, okay, I can still do this, even though it didn't pan out the way that I thought it would initially.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's incredibly important. And now I'm just really curious because I work there, but like, what's the origin story of creative science, or it used to be called creative science labs? Like, how did that
Yeah,
come to be? Because it's huge, and I'm a big fan.
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so it started about 5 years ago. I was working, I was part of something called the Startup America Partnership, which it was a 3-year initiative launched with the support of the White House, but it was completely privately funded, led by Steve Case, who's one of the co-founders of AOL. And the basic idea behind it was they wanted to help build out entrepreneurial communities within the U.S. So this was back about 5 or 6 years ago when it was the only place to start a company, and this is you either go to Boston or San Francisco, and there was a lot of entrepreneurial activity throughout the U.S. The whole idea was to help build out these communities. In any case, that ran for about 3 years. I was only a part of it for about the last year or so. And after that, I got another job at another company for a couple of months and then ended up getting fired. And then when I got fired, I decided it was just time to launch my own company. So there was 2 other guys I had been working with when I was at Startup America, and they also wanted to start their own thing. One of them had been doing sort of freelance web development work. The other one was still had a full-time job. So I took the opportunity, and originally we launched Creative Science Labs, which is now called Creative Science. And it started out as just a web development design shop. I mean, we were just building websites for individuals. And then over the last about 2 years or so, it started to really morph into this sort of behavioral economics agency that works with social impact companies and nonprofits. And the whole idea of what we do now is really understanding, what are the social, emotional, and cognitive factors that really influence somebody's decision making. And we take this as the basis to work with nonprofits to help them then go out and raise more money, get more advocates, and just basically scale their impact.
And so where did behavioral economics come from? When were you first introduced to that subject? What made you say, oh, okay, this has so much potential and could really be applied in this nonprofit digital space? Like, yeah, how did those dots connect?
Yeah, so I actually invented behavioral economics.
You have a Nobel Prize, yeah.
So I know I was somewhat familiar with the field of study. I had read Thinking Fast and Slow, and I had picked up a book called Nudge about 2 years ago by Richard Thaler. It was recommended to me by one of my friends who was getting her PhD at Hopkins and was doing a lot of work in the space. And my background up until that point was very much in the web design development. So as I was looking through this book and reading it, I noticed that a lot of the things that they talked about as a UX designer, I'm not a UX designer, but I know a lot of the principles, were very prominent in the web development space. And I thought it was really interesting. So they were doing the same type of things. They were just talking about it in a different way. And then as I began to dig a lot deeper, I found that, wow, there's a whole lot of information and research as it relates to behavioral economics, and that a lot of these principles that web designers use, there's a lot more here. And we just started basically digging and figuring out different ways that we can start to integrate this into the work that we do. And that was kind of the beginning of repositioning the company as this behavioral econ firm.
And in terms of the timeline, when did behavior economics become kind of more of a focal point, like in the website and with what you guys do? I mean, was it there from the beginning? Did it kind of come in a few years later?
Yeah, so it started to become really integrated about, I would say, a year and a half ago. And it wasn't actually until the last year or so that we really started repositioning the company as this. The first thing that I did was I kind of just started talking about it, right? Just started posting on LinkedIn, talking to clients about behavioral economics and the ways that it can be integrated into the digital work and help you do X, Y, Z. And I got a lot of positive reactions from our clients. And I think that's the biggest indicator if something's going to stick is when you start to talk to customers about it and there's a genuine just interest in it. And when that started happening, I kind of realized there's definitely something here. And then I began to really figure out, okay, how can we really start to integrate this into our brand and the work that we do? And that's when you came on board and you helped create the whole entire playbook. And we actually have a full-time behavioral scientist on staff right now. Who's doing some really awesome work with our clients and myself. And then what I'm actually really excited about is, as you know, Thomas, there's a ton of academic research as it relates to this space. But the people doing the research only have so many opportunities to test these sort of theories and ideas in a live environment. And we have the ability and the access to do that. So what I'm really excited about, we've been talking to a couple professors at UPenn and also Darden about figuring out ways that we can team up and start to run some studies with them.
Nice.
With our clients.
Yeah, no, that's super exciting. I was just thinking about that a little bit so I worked at Creative Science as a behavior econ specialist from January through May or something like that. But since I've been at the University of Amsterdam, I'm doing a master's in neuroeconomics, but currently I'm taking a class in behavior economics. And we have this fantastic professor who's he's the real deal. He's a legit behavioral economist and has published so many papers in it. And I definitely want to talk to him about what experiments he's working on because especially at the University of Amsterdam, they do a lot of innovative experiments, a lot of interdisciplinary work. So if I can find anyone who's doing behavior economics with nonprofits or neuroeconomics with nonprofits, it'd be really cool to be in the action, be in the arena for that. But I'm excited to hear that on your end, you guys, that's happening because I think that's just going to make it so much more interesting and applicable.
Yeah, and I would love that. And I'll tell you, it's really. What I love that's so powerful about digital, when I say digital, I basically mean that anything that lives online is one of when you're doing it in a physical live environment, it can be difficult to kind of track the inputs and outputs, right? But digital, because it's so sophisticated, that number one, you have access to a really, really large test demographic, which is huge. But not only that, because of the way that technology is and the advancements that we've made, is you can track so many different things. So it's a great place to start to test these theories and figure out, do they actually work?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And yeah, again, the more I think about it, the more people I talk to from very different fields, right, who know nothing about behavior economics, when I bring it up, when I would go to parties or if I was in Boulder and I went to a young farmers coalition group or something, or I go to a climate change lobby and I tell them I'm a behavior econ specialist, oh, I know nothing about farming, I know nothing about climate change, on a deep level, but I'm a behavior econ specialist, maybe it'd be useful. You should see the look in their eyes, or I'm sure you have seen that in other people. And they're like, what is behavioral economics? Because they're like, we need to persuade people. That is what we have trouble with right now, is convincing how important it is that there's people starving in Colorado and we have an overabundance in farming food and how to connect that, or these conservatives are driving me crazy about climate change, and I'm thinking, I would love to just focus on persuasion, and how behavior economics ties into that. And of course it's integral with creative science, but I was blown away, how many people were not just interested, but hungry for it almost,
Yeah. No, it's really exciting. And as you've seen, it's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
This isn't just sort of theories that don't really work. They work, and I think that the opportunity, what I'm seeing, because I come from a different angle, right? I don't come from the academic arena, but that being said, is that there is a ton of research out there, and there are tons and tons of information and people doing the work, and that type of research sometimes becomes difficult to implement into the real world, right? So there's a huge opportunity for companies like mine and private companies to go to academia and say, listen, these are the things I'm trying to accomplish. These are the things I'm trying to do. Do you want to partner up? Do you want to start to take some of the things that your theories that you've been able to test and prove and start to actually, implement them in a live environment? So that's what I see as really exciting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to add on to that, like we're living in a time like in the 21st century where it's never been easier to collaborate with people from
Yeah.
anywhere. And I mean, just how we met, although we're close, I guess, in proximity in a sense, but still, I would have never heard of, I think, creative science if it wasn't for LinkedIn. Like, I love talking to people from around the world and just thinking back to the trajectory of when I was working in creative science. I think a real highlight was when on LinkedIn I reached out to a guy named Ari who worked at the Duke Center for Advanced Hindsight with Dan O'Reilly, who's like a hero of mine. I mean, his book, Predictably Irrational, actually got me interested in the subject. And the fact that he was working there and then he wanted to talk, and then I was able to have him connect with you as well, and we were just to exchange ideas and whatnot. I just talked to him briefly again, just to see how he's doing and to tell him about this podcast. And he said like they're almost done getting an app out, the app that he had mentioned, I think back in April or whatever. But now it's like it's going to be published, and like they've like just accelerated, in many ways, and they quit their job doing that full time, and it's just really exciting to see this stuff. But when you cross pollinate with people from completely different backgrounds but are just like very curious thinkers, and more importantly see the world in a different way, like the possibilities that can come from that, it's just breathtaking. I really think we're in a kind of golden age of human connection in a sense, and opportunity. It's really astounding.
Yeah, no, we definitely are, and I think it's really exciting. And I actually keep in touch with Nick, who worked with Ari pretty closely. And just to your point on sort of reaching out to people that you've never met before and not being intimidated. I mean, the fact of the matter is that like if we have a genuine interest in the same thing, I'm going to want to talk to you, right? Like when you reach out to me, or I've reached out to other people that are in the behavioral econ space, they want to talk to you because like they're excited about this stuff, and like I love talking shop about behavioral econ. So it's just another reason that people not only are not likely to, they're not likely to reject your invitation, they're going to welcome it because they want to talk to smart people around what they're interested in.
No, absolutely. And from their perspective, it's really exciting because often when you kind of get stuck in academia a little bit, your options can feel kind of limited, and you're like, well, yeah, I know all these theories and it's fascinating, but is it important, the research am I doing? Is anyone going to read it, right? These like dense papers. And so that's kind of where you come in, where if someone were to visit your website, right, it's just very clear what you do and how you help people. But like you're kind of like a middleman in a way of like diffusing this dense research papers into like easily digestible material, and I think the playbook was helping towards that. I think it's still a bit of a work in progress, but still quite thorough. But yeah, man, I mean, the more I think back of like creative science and the work I did there and the work you guys are doing now and with your behavioral scientists, like I'm so excited to see where it goes moving forward. Like it's really quite extraordinary.
We're continuing to do what we do, but I want to spin off like a whole research lab. Like that'd be really cool to have just like a couple behavioral scientists working hand in hand with academia, and running experiments, publishing papers, and really being that gap between the in practice world, whatever you want to call it, these companies, and then the academic world, and starting to get all that amazing research that's being done. And this is a lot of what Dan actually does at his lab, which is really awesome. He's been able to create something that's what it does, right? It basically bridges the gap between the academia world and taking those theories and putting them into practice. Because as you can see, those theories and those research papers, they're amazing, but if they never get implemented anywhere, like what good are they, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, sometimes I feel like it goes in and out. I'll delete that part. With the audio. I was like, wait, am I, do we lose connection or no? Yeah. So, what was I gonna say? Fuck, there's something. I'll cut out this part, but it happens, you know. Um, oh, okay. Here we go. This is where I'll start it. So I just came up with an idea while you were talking, and what you're planning to do moving forward. Like, what if you called a lab like the Persuasion Lab, and so that way you're not just siloed in nonprofits in the digital space, but it's like you have a team of behavioral scientists. They have free reign to do whatever they want, and then you come up with this really practical research and guides on how to persuade people, you know, in any industry, and then just see what fertilizes from there, you know? Because I think that's what people who I've talked to are really interested in. It's like, how do you change people's minds? And it's not a simple thing. There
Right.
needs to be more research. So,
Right. Exactly.
yeah, so that's all incredible. Thanks for really going into a lot of good detail on creative science. Kind of going back to you, though, the human, a little bit. I think we've kind of covered what excites you, but I'm curious if there's any problems that raw you up a bit in the world, or things that keep you up at night, or just problems that intrigue you.
Bugs in my code.
Yeah, that's a bad one.
I think this concept of moving more money into the charity space, I think, is fascinating. I think that, especially our generation, and I don't want to say that they're more socially conscious than other generations, because I think that's a blanket statement.
Sure. Yeah.
But I do think there's this, with the rise of social media and how easy it is to connect and how easy it is to form groups, and our generation, I think, feels very much empowered and in getting involved in social causes. And whether that's you actually work for a nonprofit, or you work for a for-profit company that has some sort of social mission, or you work for a for-profit company but you've got something on the side that you're really passionate about, I think there's a really big opportunity to take a lot of that momentum and excitement, and leverage it in a way that can really be amplified through behavioral economics. We work with nonprofits day in and day out, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times what we see is that there's so much opportunity out there, and some of it they're just not capturing because of the way that they position certain things, or messaging, or talking about certain things. So where I see behavioral econ really playing a role is, I always say that it's not going to fix something that's completely broken, right? If your underlying mission and your nonprofit at its core is just broken, it's not going to fix that, but it can really start to amplify things that you're already doing well, right? And that's really exciting to say, like, listen, you've gotten out of the starting gate, you're already on a really, really positive trajectory. This behavioral econ can come in and add fuel to the fire and get you there that much quicker.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to frame it, to use a behavior econ thing. For sure. And just to get more specific, because when I had joined, or when I first looked at the time it was called creativesciencelabs.com website, I was like blown away by some of your clients, and the different nonprofits that you're working with. And so I was curious if there's a behavior econ intervention, or work you did with a particular website of a specific nonprofit that worked really well, or surprisingly well, or it was just kind of a bizarre experience.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. The first thing that we see again and again and again and again, and we've run studies with clients on this, we've run our own studies, is the identifiable victim effect. Like, by far is just... which, for those of anyone listening that's not familiar with the idea, but basically it's a theory that talks about there's a tendency of individuals to offer greater aid when a specific person is observed under hardship rather than a group of people. So it kind of ties back to that idea. The death of a person is a tragedy. The death of 30,000 people is a statistic. That's a really core concept that a lot of nonprofits and mission-driven organizations can start to build around. And even in the for-profit industry, it's really interesting if you ever see, especially now as brands try to move to more of a socially conscious mission, tying the story of your product or brand to an individual through a person can be really, really powerful. So that's one thing. That's a little bit more obvious. On the not as obvious side, but more technical side, there's this really interesting concept that we actually stumbled across about 4 months ago called pseudo-set framing. Are you familiar with it, Thomas?
I'm not. This is new to me.
Okay, awesome. So we have a tendency to want to complete sets. So there was a study done basically where they had given individuals a task of filling out these greeting cards. And in one, they just basically said, listen, you can fill out as many as you want. And the other one is they framed them as a set. Like, so it was sets of 4, for example. So this can actually be used in the nonprofit space where if you're trying to get somebody to complete an action, if you frame it as part of a set, it has a higher conversion rate. So a perfect example of this is, let's say I have a donor list of a bunch of previous donors and I want them to become a recurring donor, right?
Yeah.
So I could frame it either in the email on the landing page where there's like 3 parts of a set. And the first part was to become a supporter. That's done because you became a supporter. The second step is make a one-time donation, and that's done because you made a one-time donation. And then the third step would be empty, and that's become a recurring donor. So framing things as sets is actually a really interesting way to get individuals to do something.
Yeah. Wow. No, I agree 100%. Definitely want to look more into the research into that. I mean, it makes complete sense intuitively. And I'm thinking about that. I'm like, wow, this definitely applies to me personally because like I always feel like I have like a mild form of obsessive compulsive disorder, and so like sets and numbers and patterns, like it's totally ridiculous. Like if I won't start something until it's a certain time or release something at a certain date, and just in our it's something that actually makes humans beings stand out from other species in our brain is our ability to connect dots, but sometimes we do it too much, and so you can use that. No, that's really cool.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, we naturally look for patterns, and we also, as you know, we also find patterns where patterns don't exist, which is why statistics is great. But in addition to that, too, is, I mean, we have a natural tendency to group things together, to categorize things together, and a lot of that plays into some of these behavioral econ theories of how to present information. But if you've ever walked into a room, right, there's a kitchen table, and this is like the best way to think about it, and there's a chair missing. Like, how aggravating is that? There's only 3. And it's like, it's something that you would think, who cares? There's a chair missing, right? But if it's framed as a set, you're in this really kitchen, you're going, where is that other chair? Why is there a chair missing,
Yeah, no, that's totally real. Similar to that, oh man, this was a long time ago, but man, I guess it was important enough that my brain remembered it. But there's this BuzzFeed article when I used to read BuzzFeed, and they had like a list of like 30 or 40 things that'll piss you off if you have OCD or whatever. And it was just so many examples like that, where it's just one little thing is just off. You have a row of 40 items and one thing is just tilted the wrong way. And it actually made me like physically uncomfortable, scrolling through these different examples and seeing how popular this article was. I'm like, okay, this is a real phenomenon. I don't know what it is, but it's legit.
Yeah. You're completely right. And that's where the opportunities are. And I think that's the hardest part actually of doing the work that we do is when you see, for example, that BuzzFeed article, right? And you see a set of something, something's off, and you're like, I know that irritates me. Right. But figuring out, well, how can I then take that theory and apply it to the work that I'm doing? Like that gap that needs to be bridged, that's the difficult part. Like, I think it's one thing to know the theories and understand how they've been used before, but to make that new leap into sort of the specific work you're doing, that's the challenging part.
Yeah, and just I want to dive a little bit more into your process using that example, that new theory you guys are working with, so pseudo-set framing. So, like, how does your process work? You in the research or somewhere online, you find out that this is a thing, pseudo-set framing. Maybe you think about it, but then what are the next steps that go from like, I don't know, thinking about it to implementing it for a nonprofit?
So that's a great question. What we'll typically do is we'll start to do some preliminary tests using Amazon MTurk. Are you familiar?
No. Oh, or sort of. I think where I was at the end of my job, you had sent me the link to that, but I only looked at it briefly.
Basically, it's this hidden gem that I didn't know about, but actually a lot of researchers use it. So oftentimes if you read studies in a book, or even actually it's referred to in a lot of papers too, they'll either use it to sort of pre-test the theory before they actually do a test in a live environment, or sometimes actually, I mean, I read a research paper the other day was talking about tipping points for charity amounts, and they use Amazon MTurk. But basically what it is there are hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people who have signed up on Amazon MTurk to take these surveys. So we'll do a randomized control group, right? So we'll basically create a study and have, control, and then we'll have different variations of the theory that we're trying to test, pseudo-set framing in this specific case. And we'll run it through Amazon MTurk to get some data back on, okay, is this actually effective? Would this work or would this not work? And then if it is effective, we'll start to figure out ways to integrate into the work that we're actually doing. And it's actually really interesting because we ran pseudo-set framing in a couple of different scenarios. So the first one we ran was exactly what I was talking about with the 3 steps. The other thing we tried to do was combine it with the herd effect. So we had on the email they were sent, there were faces of individuals, right? And then there was a missing one. So the whole idea was that like you were the person missing from the group.
Yeah.
But it wasn't as in here, but I just thought it was interesting. Was I think that when it was a group of people, the individuals didn't view it as a set, which kind of broke the underlying theory. That's just my hypothesis on why that didn't work as well as when we had framed it the other way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And how long ago was this when this happened?
Pretty recently, about 2 months ago.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And the new behavioral scientist who's working at Creative Science, did she help with that?
Yeah, she did. So she was the point person running the studies and all that type of stuff.
Yeah. And I'm just curious with her, because I almost see like as my better successor in a sense, kind of like the next evolution. You go from like just a behavioral economic student to like a person who's actually, I think, more of a behavioral scientist. But how did she learn about creative science? How did you guys attract her or connect? Was that also LinkedIn, or I'm just curious?
Yeah, well, kind of. So I have a friend, actually. He's doing a master's program at Carnegie Mellon. And their second year track is actually in DC. And as part of their second year track, they're supposed to do a fellowship. So he knew I was doing a lot of work in behavioral economics. And he had mentioned to me that there was actually an individual in this class who was very interested in behavioral economics. And she is actually taking a few courses with Lowenstein, who teaches at Carnegie Mellon. And I got in contact with her and kind of talked to her about what we were doing. And that's kind of how it came to fruition. So it was kind of, a little bit by chance, the same sort of way that you and I had connected.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that totally works, But I remember, when you had mentioned her, and I was trying to get in touch with her because I know you had sent me an email. I don't know what it was. It might have been a month ago now or 2. Yeah. But she never did. But if she ever wants to, she knows my email. I'm happy to help. But I'm always curious, especially now that I can see like you guys are going more into the space of like, trying out experiments or going in that direction. I'm always curious to see how those go. But I remember... I
can send you a couple of the case studies that we've done, some research that she's done, if you also want to peruse through that too.
Yeah, sure. I would love to. All that stuff I find fascinating. I mean, now mentally and with the master's I'm doing, I'm heading more towards neuroeconomics, even though I think there is overlap between behavioral and neuro. But I want to kind of unpack the neuroscience of altruism. That's the direction I'm heading into, and how to lessen tribalism, because I feel like that's become more prevalent in recent years. So, a little different from what I was doing at Creative Science, but could still tie in later, like you could look at the neuroscience of the warm glow effect, for instance, and why people feel good giving money. But,
yeah, I think that it's a really interesting space, and it's exciting that you're starting to dig in there. And I mean, the other thing that we've also started to see, there's a sort of movement and rise in effective altruism too. I think getting into the question of like, why do people give? Like, what is the actual motivations behind that is super fascinating, super interesting. And from the work that we've done too, is what I think is actually really interesting, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this, is that from what I have seen and the research that we have done and seen, is that there's this interesting component where people do want to be recognized for the money they give for the work that they do, but they don't want to admit to themselves that they want to be recognized for it.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really interesting because, like, if you're talking about behavioral economics and how to get people to give more money, it's like you've got to figure out ways to recognize people
and let them know that they're going to be recognized without actually letting them know that they're going to be recognized before they do it, because then they feel selfish for doing something because if that's the reason that they're doing it. It's just like an interesting paradox.
Yes. Yeah. I know all about that. It's very convoluted. There's actually a book I read a few months ago that totally ties into that. I think you'd really love it. It came out, I think, this year, called The Elephant in the Brain by Robin Hanson, who's this economist. And he pretty much explores the dark side behind people's motivations. And so kind of has a evolutionary psychology, biology, economics, some behavior economics there too approach. But the idea is that the brain is really good at deceiving itself. And I think that's precisely what was happening in the example you mentioned, where, we want to help others and that benefits us, but if we acknowledge that it benefits us, then it doesn't benefit us as much, and it's like you want to be a hero and get attention for it, but not be asking for it, and it's a bit of a convoluted mess, but it's so common, right, that I think with social scientists, they've been able to do some research on it. It's still kind of new, but I really like the dark underbelly of things, and he has a whole chapter on charity, actually, that was very illuminating, and so I would highly recommend to our listeners and definitely to you the book. It makes you feel a little dirty, but it really deepens your understanding.
Cool. I'm gonna order it right after this.
Nice. Yeah. I remember I just started reading it. I'm like, as soon as I got to the charity chapter, I'm like, I would have used this in my research if I was still working at Creative Science. Like this would be a workbook. Yeah, but they cover everything. They cover art. They cover politics, whatever. But it's really something else. There was something else I was going to say about it. I couldn't remember. But maybe on the subject of books, just a small segue. Like, what is one book that's really influenced your life or how you think about the world that you think our listeners would benefit from?
Goodnight Moon.
Why is that?
No, I'm kidding.
Hey, it's a good book. Don't knock it.
Have you read *Sapiens*?
Yeah, that's a classic.
That's a great book. I didn't, at least in college, didn't have a huge background in sort of anthropology and that type of research, and so it was a really good background for me, at least, because I didn't know a lot about it, of just kind of how things have come to be, and it kind of puts in perspective where things are going. It's also one of those books, I think it's about 400 or 500 pages, but it actually needed to be 400 or 500 pages.
Yeah.
You'll read books, and after the first 100 pages, it just repeats itself. Right. So that was an excellent book. And sorry, I'm just looking at my bookshelf here for a second.
Nice.
The other good book, and it's very dense, I think you would actually like it. It's actually a little too dense for me. It's called Behave. It's by Robert Sapolsky.
I was going to mention that one. It's one of my favorite books. I read it a year ago. It is dense. The neurobiologist, but it inspired me to pursue neuroeconomics, actually, even though it doesn't explicitly talk about that.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
I mean, it's a great book. It's a great book. So those are probably the two. And then there's also the sequel to *Sapiens*, *Homo Deus*, too, which is phenomenal, too. It talks about, like, dataism, the data revolution, sort of machine learning. What does that mean for humans? And also, I thought was really interesting about what he had talked about in the book was this whole role that religion has always played in our ability to survive, and how with with this new idea of humans playing more of the role of God, right? And sort of health and all these different things of like, well, then how does religion fit into all of that, was a really interesting concept that he digs into in that book.
No, that's beautiful. I'm a big fan of Yuval Harari, the author of those books. He actually wrote, I don't know how he does it. He's a human I'd want to study, like under an MRI, like look at his brain, because he wrote *Sapiens*, I think in 2014 it was released. *Homo Deus* came out in 2016, 2017. He already wrote a third book that came out this year called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Just as epic as those two, just covers the present this time. And I was really inspired by this personal chapter he had at the end. The 21st chapter lesson was about meditation, because that's really profoundly shaped his life. He meditates 2 hours every day, which I think is like crazy. Wow. It's like almost like a monk. And he said it would be impossible to write *Sapiens* or *Homo Deus* if I didn't do that. I'm like, okay, I'll take your word for it. They're great books, but but what he said in that chapter is about just observation, was that he was very frustrated when he was like my age, like when he was 24, where he was doing a PhD in history in Oxford, but he was like researching something so narrow, so specific, so unuseful in a sense to most people, that he was like getting depressed, right? And his friend and angry, and his friend was like, "Oh, you got to try meditation. You got to go on this Vipassana retreats, 10-day retreat in India." And Yuval Harari is like, "Oh, fine, whatever." So he's 24 when he went to India, meditated for 10 days, and he said he learned more about the universe, humanity, and himself in that 10-day silent retreat than he did over his entire education at Oxford. And I'm like, wow, it makes me think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, that's Yuval Harari. But it was funny. I heard him on a podcast recently. I think it was the Sam Harris podcast. And he's like, okay, you covered the past, you covered the future, you covered the present. You kind of fucked yourself over now. I mean, what else are you going to write about?
Right.
Kind of covered all of humanity there, Yuval. But I would love to take a class with him. I think he is a professor in Israel. But but to just have his 3 books, and just go into depth about it would be amazing.
Right. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. So now I'm really glad you mentioned those books. I'm also kind of curious. Yeah. Now that we went into a lot of depth of creative science, which was fantastic, just to know a little more about you. Like, what is your lifestyle a bit like? Because I always think it's unique with entrepreneurs, that you can have a little more flexibility in your day, even though you're working all the time, I'm sure. Like, what's your weeks look like? What kind of routines have you developed?
Yeah, so I try to do a lot outside of work too. So aside from my day to day, I mean, I actually I play a ton of piano. I still take lessons from a jazz pianist.
Wow.
I love it's a creative outlet for me.
Absolutely.
I work out quite a bit, so I also do triathlons. And I don't know, I try to experience new things. So I've done improv, I've done stand-up comedy. I think that experiencing new things outside of your profession can actually play a huge role in helping to make you better at what it is that you're doing, even if you think they're completely unrelated. So
yeah, absolutely. I know, I agree with that. I want to hear more about the stand-up comedy. That's unique. I've always thought about trying it, but it's like such a terrifying thing. Like, what was your experience like with that?
Yeah, so it was a ton of fun. I'll tell you this much. I love public speaking, and I typically don't get very nervous before I go on stage to do public speaking. I have never been so nervous in my entire life in stand-up comedy, because it really is, right? It's this interesting dynamic where it's public speaking, right?
Yep.
But you're expected to try to get somebody to do something that everyone wants to do, and that's laugh, right? And you've got to be able to deliver. You've got to be able to deliver content and make it seem like it's off the cuff, but it's not off the cuff. And there's this expectation from the audience that they'll pick up on, whether they know it or not, whether you're being genuine and authentic.
Yeah, wow.
It combines just so many different skill sets and that's why I think that really good stand-up comedians, I mean, they're geniuses, right? And it's hard to think of them that way because they're just making jokes, but it is an art form that is very, very difficult to perfect. And my set actually went really well. Nice. I haven't done it since because I'm afraid it was a fluke.
You want to be like, you just end on a high note. Yeah.
Threw off stage. So, but yeah, no, I think it's the whole thing is really fascinating, and it teaches you a lot about public speaking, but also what makes people tick, and then also the delivery of your content is just, it really drives home that that's key, because I can have the same set list, the same content as another comedian, and depending on how we deliver that, people will be on the floor dying laughing, or people will just be sitting there just not laughing.
Yeah, humor is such a strange thing because it's like an involuntary reaction, you know? And And if somebody though is like voluntarily laughing, I think it naturally makes humans uncomfortable. Like if you come
Mhm.
across someone who laughs too much or smiles too much, you're immediately suspect, you know? So I've always been curious about that kind of stuff, but I love stand-up comedians, you know, especially like Dave Chappelle. I got to see him in Amsterdam a few weeks ago. I couldn't
Oh
believe he
yeah,
came, and you know, he did not disappoint. He's one of my favorites, and he was still just as funny as he was back in the Chappelle show days, and it was
yeah,
extraordinary, you know. And he's just so quick off his feet, and I know he's like incredibly intelligent, and you know his parents were professors, and I see him almost as a philosopher, to be honest. But he had this great quote or insight on stand-up comedy when he was interviewed at Inside the Actors Studio that I love, where he said, right, all rising comedians, they're terrified of bombing, right? You don't want to just fail miserably where it's completely silent. That's like a terrifying experience. And
right.
so he was always scared of that until the first time he bombed. And he said he's like, my family was in the audience and they were booing me. Like my grandmother was booing me. Everybody was booing me, you know? But he was so casual, Dave being Dave. He was just like, I'm standing there and I'm like, this isn't that bad. Like I didn't die, you know?
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
as horrible as my nightmares made it seem to be. And then he was like, I was fearless after that. I didn't give a shit if I failed anymore. And I thought that
yeah.
was really inspiring, you know?
That's actually really interesting. And that's kind of the way that I think about it too. Is when I go in for like a big pitch or a presentation. Like at the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen? Like people are bored, they don't enjoy it, but like you said, nobody died. Like no one's life is on the line, right?
Yeah.
Then I'll go on, they'll go on, they'll probably forget about it, and I'll forget about it, and then that's that. Really, it's really not it. It's only as big of a deal as you make it in your head. Actually, it's
Mhm.
not really that big of a deal.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I think comedians should be respected more because it's like if you're in a good position where I think you can give them the most respect because you tried it, you know, and you know how difficult it is. But for a lot of people, they think mistakenly like, oh, like he's just on a stage telling jokes. Like, yeah, I could do that. It's like,
Right.
yeah, go on stage, go show how
Right.
easy it is, you know. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much preparation that goes into it. So,
There
yeah,
is. The words are picked very carefully, and even though they sound like they're off the cuff, they're not.
yeah,
And the thing is, too, it's much different to be funny with their friends than to be funny with a random audience. Because the thing is, your friends, they have context, right? There's
yes,
this scene that's just built into whatever jokes you're telling. The thing that's really difficult about stand-up comedy is that environment does not exist, right? So as a comedian, when you get on stage, you've got to be able to really, really quickly build context in an environment when you have a diverse group of people in the room, but get everyone to understand what that environment looks like. Because if
mm,
they don't understand what that environment looks like, all of your jokes are going to fall flat, right?
yeah.
So you'll notice that the best comedians, what they often do is their stories or their bits will in some way, some form or fashion, be relatable to something that's happened to you before. Because then what starts to happen is you start to put yourself in that storyline, and that's when the jokes really start to land because you start to envision yourself walking through that scenario.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and that makes a lot of sense in the sense that like if you're seeing a new stand-up on the show Conan or something, right? In the audience, in the comment section on YouTube, like half or so, if it's a decent comedian, will like it, the other half will not, and be like, I don't get
Right.
it. Why do people like them? And it's like, well, it really depends. Yeah, the degree to which you relate to the person, you
Right.
know.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so just to go a little bit further, when you did your stand up, what was your material like? I mean, you don't need to recite any of your jokes, of course, but like, how would you connect to the audience? Or what topic would you discuss or experience?
Yeah, so the core of my stand up was about this date that I had gone on with a really attractive girl,
Oh,
and it completely blown up and I screwed it up. Why it was for two reasons I think that it did well was on stage, and this is one of the biggest pieces of advice that we had actually an instructor was part of the class had given me was that
Mhm.
you got to lean into just who you are as a person, because if
Yeah.
you don't, the audience is going to pick up on that really quickly. So but the second thing is I set the scene for very high expectations, that I was kind of nervous going out with this girl because she was so attractive. And in the whole entire date, just like one bad thing happened after another. But everyone in the audience had probably at some point in their life had either been through that type of scenario before and kind of could expect what was coming or what was down the road, or had known somebody or had seen something similar to that happening. So it was something that I think everyone in the audience in some form or fashion could relate to or understand.
Yeah, and then one final question on that subject. What was it like to have people laugh at your jokes? Like when it just hit, like they just got it, and yeah, you got the reaction you wanted.
You feel on top of the world.
I bet.
Once the first joke landed and people laughed, that's when I got some confidence, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna be okay here. And then it kind of just rolled from there. The other thing is too, and just like a business, I'll tell you, there are some jokes that I had in my set that I thought people would die laughing at and didn't get any laughs, and also vice versa. And it's the same thing with starting a company. Like there's some things that you're gonna try to sell or pitch that you think people are gonna love, and they're not going to, and there's some things that you'll accidentally try to sell and people do love it. So it's just kind of interesting that you don't really know until you put it out there.
Yeah. So yeah, that could be a great piece of advice for our listeners. It's like, just put things out. You never know what's going to stick.
Yeah. And that's what stand-up comedy really is. I mean, you talk about a lot of these comedians, and they'll actually, before they go on their HBO specials, they'll go to smaller comedy clubs, all around the United States and just test material, right? And they're just throwing things out there and kind of see what hits and what doesn't, because they don't know. I mean, they have an idea of what might work, what might not work, but they don't really know until they try it.
Yeah. And actually, a good example of this, I mean, now his name is like in infamy now, and he's controversial and terrible, but Louis C.K., the reason I bring him up, recent things aside, is that he was a pretty mediocre stand-up comedian for a long time. He really didn't become stratospherically successful until his 40s. Like after he was divorced, had children, that was like a big source of his material. But the 20 years of failure was essential to be who Louis C.K., became essentially. And the turning point for him that I thought was so extraordinary was he was listening to an interview with George Carlin, one of the greatest stand-up comedians, who was notorious for every year throwing away his material and starting afresh and doing a whole new set every single year. And very few comedians, I think, do that successfully, at least. And as soon as Louis C.K. heard that, because he was always telling the same old jokes, just thinking if he changed it slightly, they would be funny. And as soon as he started, it's like taking off your safety harness, and just plunging into the dark. And it's freedom, but it's terrifying. And so once he started doing that and just working ruthlessly, and just cutting everything out, that's when he became famous and successful. So I thought that was really cool.
That's super interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah, I know that. I actually didn't know that he was working at it for so long before he actually blew up. That's actually really interesting.
Yeah, if you go on YouTube and look up like young Louis C.K., there's clips of him like in the 80s when he was like, my age. And it's like, you're right, he has like a clean shaven face. He's not as overweight, full head of hair. It's kind of funny, And I still think he was funny, but just very different, just very different.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So no, that's really great. Another question I like to ask guys that kind of relates, but just to see who inspires you or you're interested in, like, if you could have a coffee conversation with anyone, alive or dead, who would it be?
It would definitely be my grandfather. He passed away when I was, not very young, I guess in 8th grade, but he was an inventor, and he actually, he worked for large corporations, so he worked for Clairol and a number of other large corporations, and he was named the inventor or co-inventor on, I think, like 50 some odd patents. One of them is actually the tweezers. And I think I know that I get a lot of my entrepreneurial sort of tick from him and his, I guess, genetic makeup. And I think you come to know your parents and also your grandparents in a very different way when you're older versus when you're younger. So I never really got to know him as myself now. And it's really interesting to see a lot of the things that I naturally do that he had talked about when he was still alive. So it would just be really interesting to start to see as I've sort of grown into my own entrepreneurship track, some of the things that he would recognize.
Yeah, just to expand on that more, like what connections do you think there would be, like possibly, or?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting that, so he actually grew up in Vienna, Austria, and he came over to the U.S. with just a high school degree, and this was after the war. He's a Holocaust survivor, and before he passed, he wrote these memoirs, basically chronicling the time in Vienna and some of the things that he went through. And there's a story in his memoirs about his father, who would have been my great-grandfather, and about him buying old tractors through the classifieds, cleaning them up, and then selling them. And I didn't read this story until I was out of college, but we talked about this a little bit earlier in the interview, but in college, I was buying cell phones on Craigslist and then selling them on eBay. So it was interesting for me to read that and see that here I was doing basically the same exact thing that he was doing decades later without even knowing that he had ever done it. And it kind of really hit home, like, wow, this is really this is who I am. This is part of my genetic makeup. I do these things naturally without sort of learning or being told about them.
Yeah, that must have been just such a beautiful feeling to have, this kind of confirmation where it's like, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Like there's a history here.
Exactly.
And the kind of neuroscientist in me or wannabe of me, like what I think of is like, like how much do genetics play a role in who we are? And with being an entrepreneur, is there an entrepreneurial gene, or something? Because earlier this year on my podcast, I interviewed a friend I've known for like 20 years now, and he wants to be an entrepreneur. His father was a very successful entrepreneur, and it's interesting though sometimes that can pass down a little bit, just maybe it's not like being an entrepreneur that you inherit, but like orthogonal thinking, for instance, or just not accepting the status quo as much, being like, yeah, I don't want to work for Deloitte, I want to create my own thing. No, that's really profound. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think to your point about the entrepreneurial gene, I've always been a firm believer, whether it's entrepreneurship or not. I mean, if I think you're genetically predisposed to certain things, right? Yeah. There's just, whether it's entrepreneurship or not entrepreneurship, and like in your case, it's neuroscience, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm a firm believer, and I remember I had this argument with somebody in high school once. It's like, you can only truly excel at something if there's some natural tendency to be good at it. And it's not because you're it's not because you're naturally gifted at something that you excel. I think you excel because you enjoy doing the work. And you can only get so far doing work that you don't like. And if you actually enjoy doing it, which means there's some sort of just natural inclination to do that type of work, that's when you can really put yourself on this trajectory to really be successful in whatever field it is that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think it's a real tragedy in our times, all the people who are doing things that they really hate, and they just think, this is just the way it is. I need to do my 9-to-5 job because it's stable, and that's what everyone I know does, and that's just the way it is. Work sucks. And it's like, when you break down what percentage of your life you spend working in your career or in your jobs, and if you hate what you're doing, I mean, you're hating most of your life, basically. You know? And of course, it's very difficult. Who am I to say to somebody who's working at some factory or somewhere, for decades, to like, oh, go be an entrepreneur, just take the plunge. But at the same time, especially, I can't emphasize enough, living in the 21st century, where we're having this conversation right now. It's magic to me to be talking to you where, you're in DC, I'm in Amsterdam, and we're just talking about your life. And like, there's just no excuses. If anyone's listening to this, you have an iPhone probably or a computer. The connections that you can make and the things you can do are truly limitless. And I don't mean that in like a feel-good, positive thinking way. It's like, no, just honestly, tangibly, it's anything, not anything, but most things are possible. You just have to work at it,
Yeah, exactly. And it just reminds me of a conversation I actually had yesterday with somebody who recently became a UX designer, and she was working for a completely different company. And I think that a lot of people, when they do want to make a career switch or pursue something that they really enjoy, they think that they've got to make this drastic change, right? Like, I've got to quit my job, I've got to go X, Y, Z. And like, you don't, right? If you're interested in something, there's no reason you can't start to learn about it, work in the field, do things on the side, and then figure out, like, if, for example, let's say you want to be a designer and currently you're an accountant, right? Start taking design courses, volunteer to do design work, and then you'll figure out, like, is this actually something I really do enjoy, or did I just think I enjoyed it? And then once you start doing it, if it is something you actually really enjoy, then you'll start to figure out, well, okay, how do I make the transition 100%? So just to piggyback on your point, if there is something that you're passionate about, start working on it. Even if it's not full time, just start chipping away at it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and to add to that, whenever I make a recommendation to anybody if they're struggling with something or some way to improve their life, usually their go-to excuse is, "Oh, I don't have enough time," and that's something that's always really bothered me. The extreme example I use is, "Oh, if you don't have enough time, go to bed at 8 p.m., wake up at 3 a.m., you'll still get 7 hours, and you'll be bored before anyone wakes up," and you have time. But you don't have to do that. But the point is, like, if you look at people, whether they're artists, whether they're entrepreneurs, whether they're CEOs, whatever it is that they do, how they manage their time is they do it very carefully, very methodically. And I guarantee that you do have time to work on that side passion project you have. And it's worth it to do it. You might not see the results tomorrow or next week or next month or even next year. But if you consistently work away at it, whatever that passion is, something will come out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like, and I know you being an entrepreneur, I think you've always probably been quite cognizant of time, right? I mean, you have to plan your time really carefully when you're an entrepreneur, because you also have the control to as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, so whenever I have the opportunity to get on a soapbox about time, I do it, because it's like, look at what Elon Musk accomplishes in 1 week.
Right.
There's something to learn there. But to continue, I'm kind of curious now. Now we're at this stage in the conversation. Like, what is your future looking like? What would you still like to do? Right? I mean, first of all, tell the audience how old you are, and then what your next decade is looking like, or some plans you have.
Yeah, so I'm 30 years old currently, and it's a good question. I don't really know, but I like that I don't know. I mean, there's definitely, in the sort of the near term right now, is starting to really build out the company, the behavioral economics and the social good space, kind of see where that leads. I mean, start to get more into sort of the academic research space in regards to this, and then kind of see where it goes from there. I don't have, obviously I'd like to keep growing the company and things of that nature, but there's nothing super specific in the next 10 years that I don't want to say this like I don't have any goals, like I obviously do, but what I really enjoy right now, and I've been able to really, I think, hone in on that in the last year or two, is this behavioral econ social good space. So as long as I'm doing work in there and I'm feeling fulfilled and I feel like that I'm being challenged, I'm going to continue to dig there. And then
Beautiful.
If I ever don't, I'll move on to something else. But right now, I mean, this is what makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's been working really, really nicely, and yeah, and so you've been living in Washington, D.C. for how long? Like, I know that's where I met you.
Yeah, so I graduated in 2010, and I've actually been here since I graduated.
Wow. So yeah, just briefly, I mean, what has that been like? I mean, the culture there, and how do you think that shaped you, that environment a bit? Because I think environment does play a large role.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of really smart people in DC, which is great, right? So you typically run into somebody, and the types of things that you talk about, obviously sometimes they're politics, but they're just typically a lot of smart people with a lot of smart ideas. And I think what you find in DC, genuinely a lot of people are looking to really make an impact in some form or fashion. It's not I don't know this for a fact, but New York City seems like a little bit more of like a money hungry type of city, right?
Sure, yeah.
Finance and bankers and things of that nature. But here, people, want to be successful, but also want to sort of make their name known, but in a good way. And the city in general, I mean, this has completely changed in the last, 7 or 8 years. There used to be like 1 or 2 neighborhoods you would go out in or sort of spend time in. And now, I mean, the whole entire city is just going through this complete revitalization right now. And then I'm sure that you heard that Amazon is actually making their second headquarters just across the river in Crystal City. And I mean, that's only going to add to kind of what's already been happening in the city. So it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to hear that. I had a bit of a culture shock when I went from Boulder, Colorado, my hometown, to Washington, D.C. for school.
Yeah.
But it was inspiring in a way. I mean, I loved studying economics in DC, where I would go to the International Institute for Economic Policy, or I'd go visit the World Bank, and it's like literally just a few blocks away, you know? Like GW is in a very good location. And like just being able to brush shoulders with all these, quote unquote important people, but really, brilliant thinkers and such, was very motivating, you know? So I think it has shaped me positively as well. I'm curious. I remember when I first joined creative science, you went on a trip to Thailand, I think, and you were in Southeast Asia, and I thought that was pretty cool. I like to travel as well. I'm just curious, like, if you could visit anywhere. So you've been in DC for a long time, but if you could spend, I don't know, a month or two in any location on Earth, where would it be and why?
I would probably go back to Israel.
Mm.
I mean, it's an amazing state, and I think the culture there is really amazing, and it would be interesting to really spend some sort of time there on an ongoing basis and kind of experience that. I mean, I've been on trips, but I haven't really spent, I would say, more than 2 weeks there at any given time. And I've actually thought about it and tried to figure out how I can kind of still work. The time zone's a little bit of a challenge.
Sure. Yeah.
It's about 9 hours or so ahead.
Mm.
So, but that would be really cool.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's funny. My best friend from Boulder, I think today he's arriving in Israel. He's going to live there for a few months. Just kind of a coincidence. He's Jewish. I think he's done birthright. I'm half Jewish, but I was talking to some Israeli guys in a hostel I met in San Francisco, and they said I could do birthright as well. So I'm certainly considering it.
You should do it.
Yeah.
If you're half Jewish, they'll let you in, no problem.
Yeah, every Jewish person I talked to who's done it, and I mentioned that they have the same response. Do it.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty amazing. Yeah.
I mean, you would be dumb not. It's a free trip to Israel.
I know.
It's an incredible experience, and then I mean, even if it wasn't an incredible experience, if someone told you could take a free trip overseas anywhere, like,
I would say yes.
For
Yeah.
the most part, you take it. You know.
What was Israel like briefly, like when you visit there? I know it must be so different, and I've seen videos, but like to actually be breathing there, like what struck you? The history, the ambiance, the food, the women. What stood out?
Yeah, so on Birthright, you go all over the place, right?
Nice.
So you're spending time in Tel Aviv, which has somewhat of even like a Miami type of feel. Like it's very modernized. There's a ton going on. It's somewhat even westernized. And then there's also like you'll spend time in like a Bedouin tent in the middle of a desert, in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
So it kind of runs the mix, right? But it's an amazing experience. I think that in the sort of more city-ish areas, like it's very fast paced. It's got a very quick feel to it, and there's also just a lot of there's a lot of pride there, right? And not to say that like in the U.S. there's not, but I also think as a byproduct of everyone having to serve military time in the Army, really creates an interesting culture around just the country as a whole too.
Yeah, no, for sure. And adding to that, just the history of the Jewish people. I mean, it makes sense how close they are to one another,
Right.
with everything they've endured. So, yeah.
Right.
No, that makes complete sense. Yeah, Israel keeps coming back and back into my mind. Reading Thinking Fast and Slow and hearing about Danny Kahneman's, experience working with the Israeli army was really illuminating. And Amos Tversky's, both of them, yeah. And Conan recently, or not that recently, but I saw a video of him in Israel, and also training with like Gal Gadot and women in the Israeli Defense Force. Like that was really cool. Yeah, it's just this place that keeps coming back in my mind. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It is a pretty remarkable place.
Yes.
And just to kind of conclude our interview, I mean, this has been really quite extraordinary. I think we've covered many important and interesting topics, but for our listeners, what are the most memorable words of advice you ever received?
So I'm going to give you two quotes.
Great.
One is very business focused, and the other one is not business focused. So business focused, somebody said to me once, "Cash is king," and it's true. I mean, cash in your company it's your oxygen, right?
Yes.
So that really is what matters. Like, you can be generating $10 million of revenue, but if you have no cash on hand, like, it doesn't really matter that you're generating that much revenue. So cash is king is a good one. And then I think just going back to Steve Jobs and what he said about only being able to connect the dots looking backwards, I think is really important to understand that, and also just internalize that concept. Is that I think especially when you're young, you're right at college, is that there's often this tendency to make sure that what you're doing is lining up to this sort of future goal that you have, whatever that may be. But knowing that if you're doing what you're passionate about and what you want to be doing and pursuing the things that actually interest you, like, eventually things will start to make sense. So just kind of keeping that in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to end this. Nate, thank you so much for coming to the
Thanks for
roundtable.
having me. It's been awesome.